So, good afternoon. Thanks very much for attending this session. My name is David Evans. I work for a small specialist consultancy called Yuri. It's essentially myself and GOTO, the author of a book, or a couple of books, including the title of this session, Specification by Example. Now, a 90-minute session is a slightly unusual format. It's not a very common session at conferences. Obviously, you've always got typical 45-minute talks, or you've got workshops and so forth. And this is kind of a little bit in between. So it is an experiment for me because I haven't done this format before. So my timing might be at risk. We'll see how we go. The point, however, is that 90 minutes is definitely too long for you to be sat there listening to me talk at you. It's a little short for us to sort of get properly into workshops, but given that it's not too large a group, I'm hoping that we can focus on some interactive exercise for this, because for this topic, it could be argued that the theory behind it is actually pretty straightforward. The difficulty is in how do you actually do this? You know, all the questions seem to arise when you actually try it out for yourself. So I'm going to give us a couple of opportunities to try things out directly. The central premise, if you like, or the central thesis of specification by example is pretty straightforward. And I tend to sum it up just with this little diagram. So it's really the basis that being able to use concrete examples, being able to use examples that our business people, the users of our software, would use in their descriptions of expected behavior or expected software requirements is a very natural thing for people to do, and yet we don't really treat examples as first-order items in our process. We tend to think of examples as just a means to an end. You know, you might have a business analyst or someone like that going and talking to users to understand the way their process works, and they'll say, well, for example, I would do this or that, and it's, oh, okay, right, and give me another example. Well, under this circumstances, I might do something different. And they generalize the rules out of that. Well, that's fine, that's what we need to do, because we need to end up software that satisfies the general rule. The trouble is those examples tend to just be thrown away because we've now got a much more formal specification or analysis document that just covers the general case. Of course, the problem is that when we've got that general specification, somebody needs to turn that into code, so you tend to need to think in concrete terms when you're actually doing your design. You need to understand, well, what are the actual cases by which this would be used. So you might be inventing examples in your head for that process. Similarly, software gets handed off to testers. What do they need to do? Well, they need to come up with examples for use as test cases. What are some example scenarios I could put this software through in order to test that I've satisfied the requirements? Once again, we're sort of treating the examples at each point as a temporary throwaway thing. And everyone's sort of reinventing different sets of examples without sort of having a common viewpoint. So specification by example is really just a simple idea of saying, what if we preserved those examples that we used as a discussion with the users or the stakeholders in the first place as first-order items in our process? What if we actually gave them some importance and care and preserved them such that they could inform all of the steps in our process, from design, implementation, and testing? So this little triangle is commonly used as the summary of SPE. It's that it's showing this dual relationship that examples have in being able to clarify what we mean when we talk about our general software requirements. But if expressed in the right way and expressed with the right level of detail, those same examples that are just useful for getting a shared understanding can actually be used as the same test cases that would verify that we've in fact satisfied those requirements when we do the implementation. That's a very, as I say, simple idea of SPE. Content of this session is about taking that simple idea and showing that there are a number of useful patterns that emerge from that. And these patterns are really what we've seen good teams use in applying the ideas of SBE or BDD, acceptance test-driven development, and some other things. Because sometimes people say, well, what is the difference between SBE and BDD? That's a very common question. And we like to say, well, at its heart, it's the same idea, but SBE sort of encompasses a number of patterns that you might sort of say, well, you're not doing, that's not BDD if you're just doing that. If you're just talking in terms of examples, then that's not BDD. Or if you're just using a particular type of test automation tool, well, that's not a proper BDD tool. You get a lot of concerns or questions like that. We're saying, well, as long as you're adopting some of these patterns, then you could arguably say that you're doing SBE. So what are those patterns? Well, in a nutshell, this is the sort of cycle. And be careful to point out that this is not meant to be a process flow. As I say, very few teams actually succeed in doing all of these things consistently all the time. What we do see is teams that say, well, we major on this particular pattern, we major on this particular aspect in order to help us succeed. And I'm hoping that what you'll find from here, if you're already doing something like acceptance test-driven development or BDD, that you might sort of be able to see some of the reasons why you might be struggling or why it might not be working as effectively as you'd like. Maybe it's because some of the patterns in this set are things that your organisation it wasn't sort of consciously addressing or hasn't really been able to overcome. So in very, very quick terms, one starts sort of here around about 11 o'clock with a business goal or some kind of design effect for a given period of time, whether that's a release period or whether it's a sprint. Typically it's something a little higher level. It's some kind of business milestone. And the pattern of deriving scope from goals is what turns that consciously into items of work that a delivery team can actually pick up. So typically that's going to be user stories if you're using an Agile process, but it could be something, some equivalent or similar thing like use cases. And that sort of conscious linking of the business goal to the scope is the important part of that pattern. The next sort of pattern, well, it's really a pair of patterns, is being able to specify collaboratively, and we take each of those items and need to get to the details of them. And in doing so, we illustrate the important details with concrete examples. So specifying collaboratively and illustrating with examples is what we do with our user stories, and from those we derive key examples that help us to understand or get to a common understanding of what's important in each of those. There's a subsequent pattern of refining a specification. That's where key examples, which really are just a very low fidelity thing. Typically these are things we might create on a whiteboard, and we're going through a couple of exercises like that today to see what we mean. We need to be able to turn that into something that is a little more long-lived, something that actually can serve a few more purposes. So the thing that we create out of that is a specification supported by examples, or specification with examples. So it's simply a style that sort of blends some plain language descriptions of what our business rules are, supported by concrete examples that illustrate those rules. The pattern down across the bottom there is probably what people are most familiar with if they're thinking BDD or ATDD, and that's the actual sort of creating automated tests out of these things. The pattern that we sort of stress as important here is that we're automating validation without changing the specifications. That is, whatever was useful as documentation, whatever was very readable and understandable at this point, when we've refined into something strong, that should be the same thing that becomes our automated test. That's what we like to say, that what we're creating is not just automated test, but executable specification. Specification is self-checking. And then the final sort of pattern of evolving a documentation system and validating frequently or validating continuously is what allows us to get from sets of individual executable specifications into what we'll call a living documentation system. So we are focusing here on making sure we don't just treat each story as an item we ticked off a backlog, but instead we say that the result of each change that we make should be contributing towards a body of documentation that actually is living in the sense that it's always being updated, it's always sort of keeping pace with the evolution of our software, but it's also living in the sense that it's self-checking because it's comprised of executable specifications. So we know when there's a discrepancy or a regression or a drift away from what we say the system does versus what it actually does. So it's living in that sense. Okay, so over the course of this session, I'm going to examine through a couple of exercises the details of a few of these important patterns. We won't have time to do them all, but we'll sort of pick out the important ones. So this first area of being able to derive our scope from business goals, there's a number of techniques that are useful here. I'm just going to pick on one of them today. Sorts of things that we do. This is all sort of in the field of you might say stuff that happens to the left of the sprint backlog. It's all the things you do effectively as part of analysis, grooming, understanding what the longer term projections are before you actually get down to the items that you would consider to be stories small enough to fit into the sprint. So impact mapping, feature injection, these are all useful things. Story mapping is the one that I'm going to look at today, not because it's any better or worse than the others. I just thought, well, we don't have time to go through all of them, and story mapping is a good, useful technique. It's fairly easy for people to get their heads around, and arguably it's the easiest one to sort of take away out of these. In order to do so, though, we're going to need to introduce a domain that will be used through the rest of these explanatory exercises. And for our purposes, that's the game of blackjack. So what I need you to do, the simplest way to do this is everyone just stands up, because A, you'll get the oxygen to your head, and then it'll be a simple sorting process. So you all have to stand up to start with. Now, there'll be a series of questions. So if you've you remain standing, if you've ever played either blackjack, 21, or pontoon, they're all colour games. If that's not true of anyone, you can sit down. As long as you've played any of those games sometime in your life, you just remain standing. Good? Okay, a couple of you have never heard of 21, pontoon, or blackjack. Okay, fine. Of those who are still standing, who would say that they would remember what the basic rules of blackjack are? In terms of, well, you bust if you're more than 21, and you can hit, you can stand. You basically, you'd roughly be able to explain that to someone. If that's not true, you can sit down. Okay, good. Now, of the people that are still standing, this time I want you to raise your hand if you've been in a casino and played blackjack at a casino betting your own money. Okay, only one? All right, good. That means I need everyone else to remain standing. And just stick a little pink one of these on you. Make it easy to identify you. And I'll get you to hand the others back for me. Thanks. And sorry, the gentleman who did raise his hand, is that you? Okay, so you do need a pink sticker, but I'm also going to ask you to come up front. So the rest can sit down. I want you to come to the front. Get your pink sticky on. But it's all right, I'm not picking on you because I'm picking on you as well. So you'll need to stand up as well. So your name is?
Michael.
Okay, Michael.
Sorry.
Michael and Simon are going to help us through this exercise. Okay, as our resident blackjack experts. So what I'm going to do is I just want to quickly distinguish between, say, a simple version of blackjack. Imagine it's our job to build a game of blackjack that sort of follows all the casino betting rules. But we want to start with a simple version rather than the full version. So on here I've sort of randomly stuck a bunch of sort of, well, pseudo scope items. Some of these are rules, some of these are sort of things that happen in the game, like events. Some of them are just sort of general things that you need to consider. And your job as a pair is to distinguish between a simple game of blackjack versus a full game of blackjack that you might sort of find in a casino. Okay, so all of these things should be familiar to you because you're self-identified as people who know what blackjack is. So what I'm going to do is I just want you to put things above the line or below the line. So that's a simple game above that line, and that's the full game below the line. All right, but talk to each other and talk so that the audience can see it. But maybe one of you come this side and one stay on the other side, so everyone can see what your thought process is. And fairly quickly sort them into things that would be included in a simple game and leave the other stuff below the line.
Player and dealer can both be there, and basic, basic rule, even simple games, multiplayer. Hit stand, yeah. Deal 2 cards each.
A bit more kind of
winning. I see we're doing a gambling game.
no,
so you
do
can
that.
place
Yeah.
no, which is a bit complicated.
Yeah, that's good.
I've only been playing those pushes.
Yeah.
Doubles, split hand,
No.
That's, I don't know about that one.
I'm not sure about that. I think.
Okay, so I wouldn't argue with too much of that, but these ones that you felt close to the line, I think, are interesting. So that maybe it's not clear what those mean. So dealing 2 cards each is what happens at the beginning of the game. Okay, well it's just you call it the initial deal. So I don't know, I would see that as being pretty fundamental.
Yeah.
So let's put that one in. And then the dealer hits until 17 or higher. Again, that's sort of fairly central to the idea of casino blackjack, isn't it? If we didn't do that, if we left that only for the full game, what might be the alternative?
Then we can stop whenever they want or carry whenever they want.
Okay, so here's an important thing. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to simulate the dealer's behavior in casino blackjack. And the important thing about casino blackjack is that the dealer doesn't actually have any choices. They follow very strict rules. That's why it's a valid gambling game, because you're effectively playing against the house. The person who's doing the deal is really mechanically following the rules. He or she doesn't actually have any choices about what she does. So I think we need to include that one as well. Okay, but now our simple game is looking a little heavy. And interestingly, there was a little bit of discussion between the two guys as well, what are we including? And as soon as one thing came in, like, well, we've got to pay our winnings, then being able to place a bet sort of was carried along with it. So what opportunity is there for simplifying that further? We could make it a non-betting game, in which case place a bet and pay our winnings would drop out. So let's move those down. And then the other thing you chose, which you seem to hesitate on, was multiplayer. So again, if we didn't do multiplayer, is there a valid alternative? It would just be a single player game, I guess. Just one person against the dealer. So in casino blackjack, you're actually, when you go to a table, you're playing as an individual against the house, not against the other people at the table. So it's a series of individual hands that are being played out. We could simplify our game by saying, okay, we just allow one player against the house or one player against the dealer and not do multiplayer. Okay, so that's one way of representing a potential set of scoping decisions. What I want to do now, though, is to turn this into a more useful map. And for that, we need effectively 2 dimensions rather than just a single dimension of above or below the line. So, can you tell me what's the approximate sequence of events that happens in a casino blackjack game? If I rock up at a table, what goes on?
You have to bet, or also give you a card.
Okay, so
already shuffled the pack beforehand.
okay, so they shuffle, I put my money down.
Put money down, then it'll deal around to everyone.
Yeah.
You can see the dealer's cards.
Yeah.
Usually you'll have 2 cards, and
Yeah.
then you'll have various choices when you come around to use bet. Whether you
Okay,
want to stick or get another card. Basically.
So-
So simple here.
so I've got effectively a setup where the sort of deal takes place, yeah?
Yeah.
And then you say the player gets to do something?
Player chooses their next action. Yeah.
Okay, what happens after that?
Then once all the players have done or finished their actions,
Yep.
the dealer follows his rules,
Uh-huh, okay,
and then you determine who won and lost.
okay.
Stand up.
This is where I do my Darren Brown thing, so I didn't influence you at all. There's a totally free choice at that. Okay, so if we treat each of those 4 sort of phases or stages of the game sequence, now I just want you to organise each of those elements into the right columns. Yeah, so the ace is a little bit awkward, but yeah, I guess we could count that as it's sort of a setup thing. Well, I don't know, it's up to you. It's more of an underlying rule, isn't it? It applies
Yeah.
both to the player and the dealer. But yes, okay, that's fine. Okay, and similarly with the things that are out of scope or in our full game, just make sure those are in the right. So insurance and splitting are things that a player can choose to do. And doubling, yeah.
What is winning lose push?
Okay, so does the player win? Do they lose, or is it a push, or is it an equal thing? So that's the way that was intended. Is that's that would sort of precede, I guess, paying out winnings. So you need to do that whether you're betting or not, don't you? As you need to understand what is the outcome of the game.
I should have going there.
Exactly. All right. So the only thing I might change there is I would say that's probably that with the dealer column, and that's definitely a gain outcome type thing. Okay, and then we can do that sort of thing. Okay, so now we've got a second dimension to what we're doing, but we're still just saying it's either above the line or it's below the line. The purpose of story mapping is to help you take more control over your scope decisions by creating effectively as sparse a table as possible. We want to find some horizontal stripes that we can put through these stories where there's as little above the line as possible, because we want to commit to as little as possible and still produce something that's useful. So here's the challenge now. We've already said, okay, all of those 7 or so, 7 stories above the line are part of a simple game. But what if we sort of push the envelope even further and said, well, what's an even simpler version? We've already dropped betting, we've already dropped multiplayer. Can we simplify that game even further? Sorry, say again. The problem with the ace, yes. I mean, the ace arguably is one of the most complex aspects of blackjack. The fact that its behaviour changes depending on the rest of the cards in your hand. So if you drop that down, if you said that wasn't part of that first stripe, what's your alternative?
It's always 1. Or it's always 11.
Right, so you've got to choose what is the ace worth, and what would be the right choice there?
Ace is 1.
1.
How many more votes? Okay, what's the advantages of choosing 1?
Simple.
Okay, but is it any more simple than 11? Can you argue on that basis?
Not in 1 place. I'll go with 11.
Okay, why did you change your mind?
Because we've already got 1.
Have you already got 1? No? What card is 1 if it's not an ace?
No, okay.
So, why did you think 11?
Well, at the end of the game, to get 21, you can't do that.
Ah, yes, I think that's a good argument. So yes, I would go with an ace is 11. And then we would say, probably it's a pretty important thing to come soon. But we can effectively simplify the value of the ace. Now, what else could we do? Just, again, making something ultra simple.
Change out the win-lose.
Well, here's the thing. The idea of a story map is that the reason we went through one of the phases is that we always want to find what is the last thing, what actually represents the outputs in our system. Because you'll see this with anything that you do when you're trying to understand what those sequences are. You'll start with some kind of input, you'll have some kind of processing, and you'll have some kind of output. And it's very, very important to get to the output, because that's where the value is in your system. So if we didn't do the output, we'd be arguably not having a testable or a shippable increment. And what you're trying to do with a story map, especially when you're looking at what is our first strike, is to understand what's the thing this system needs to do where I defer how well it does it. Okay, so we're trying to get to the what of the game, even if it means what it does is done pretty badly, but I'm going to incrementally improve how well it does the what. I always have to start with the what. Now, in a game, what's the what? What's the essence of a game, let alone a game of blackjack? What's the thing that really has to happen for it to be called a game?
Win-lose.
Yeah, you don't want to be able to win or lose. So I think that is absolutely, that one can't move. But potentially everything else could. Well, at least we'll test that theory.
You could make the player not mutual seeker.
Yeah, so if we said the dealer and the player both, let's sort of keep these aligned. So now we're sort of looking at horizontal relationships here. And we'll say the ace is kind of paired up in that. And now we're sort of imagining a line across there. So what does that sort of game look like? We've said we've dealt 2 cards out each. We don't give the player any options. We don't give the dealer any options, but we do determine win, lose, or push. So does that work? It kind of does.
It should come off the 21.
Yeah, it's kind of, and I call this pattern the sort of, the system for your 5-year-old. What is the version of your system that would just work such that a 5-year-old would understand? If you're trying to teach blackjack to a 5-year-old, what might you do? It's simply, okay, can you add up these cards? Who won? They randomly came out. It's a game. It's not very fun for very long, but it kind of, but that's what I mean. The funness of the game is a quality that we want to incrementally improve, but it still does what it does from the very beginning. And that's the thing that we're trying to get at when we're having our scope discussions. So now, can we push down dealer can bust? Presumably we can bust if we could do something like this. So we could say, well, a player can hit, but they don't bust. Could we do it that way around? It sort of doesn't really make sense. If you're going to let somebody take another card, there really has to be some limit to it. Otherwise, it's the highest hand win doesn't really work, does it? So it sort of suggests bust needs to sort of become first. Also, there's another reason for that, isn't there? It's because I could, due to this choice here, the ace is 11, it is possible that I bust on the initial deal, isn't it? If I've got dealt 2 aces, and we're saying they're both worth 11, and I've got 22, and I'm bust. So, in order for if we're deferring the calculation of whether I bust or not, and I simply just want that rule of whoever has the higher hand value wins, then I need to make a special rule, which is that, well, 22, what am I doing with that? Well, 2 aces, is that a good hand or a bad hand? And you probably therefore have to make a conscious decision that, okay, 22 is not bust. And you put that into the early thing, and then as soon as you implement player busts, well, anything over 21 is a bust. So you would say, yeah, bust over 21, which is the proper rule. Now, the other thing that we would do as we're going through this is say, what are our horizontal relationships here? Now, just as you said, being able to include payout the winnings sort of brings betting along with it. You can then sort of do that sort of relationship here. We could say, well, let's defer all this complex stuff like insurance splitting and doubling, and then say, as soon as I'm allowed to place a bet, I have to calculate payout winnings. So I've got a horizontal stripe there, and I can defer other sort of betting relationships here. I can defer all this later. I could decide, okay, I want to drop multiplayer down and just have a single player betting game. The point of the map is that you'll get a lot of options that you need to sort of make explicit. And otherwise, these things, you remember, if we've only ever got a sort of flat backlog, a list of stories, it's very hard for us to consciously see these relationships between these things we need to do. It's very hard for us to be able to make connections between, you know, what does it give us when we reach this particular thing? All we've got is a sprint, you know, where more and more stories are ending. But the story map allows us to see, okay, well, I've got a sort of a simple line here that I could probably put some kind of description on. I've got another one there. Potentially I could just deal, you know, treat that as another shippable increment. The point is we're trying to give ourselves as many options as possible for being able to say, I've still got something that is a nameable step up from what I had before. Okay, well thanks guys. We will utilize the outcomes of that. Essentially, that's what we created. Those green lines that I started to draw, I mentioned are representing sort of logical collections or logical groupings of the things that are above the line. And the key to a story map is to try and put some kind of meaningful name against those. Try to make them named milestones that sort of say, well, once we don't, when we do this, what is it we have? You know, what is the capability that we've reached, or what is the thing that we can say this version or this little increment actually gives us? And the idea of naming that is it forces you to challenge, you know, what that is defined as. If I just said, well, that's milestone 1, or that's just, you know, release 1, it's somewhat arbitrary what is above the line and what's below it. Whereas if you name it something meaningful, then you can start to challenge, well, do I need all the 3 of those stories to achieve that? Or does one of these sort of need to go above the line? You can have useful discussions around what moves up or what moves down. And then, of course, the other aspect you can put on this is that you can use it as a planning tool. So once you've got some kind of estimate against each of these and a reliable velocity of the team, you can actually say, well, based on our current velocity, we're going to reach these points by these sprints or these iterations. It's a separate matter how accurate that is. But the point of the matter is that you can this is a representation of time, and that will sort of shift as you go through and replan your work. Okay, so that's one way of using concrete examples of making explicit your choices about what is the business goal we need to achieve, and it's things like, is it more important to get betting out there so that we can monetize this, or is it more important we just want a fun, free version that we get that attracts as many players as possible? Is multiplayer important? Are we chasing the sort of social gaming market? You know, whatever those business goals might be can be articulated and reflected in a story map in a more sensible way than a typical flat backlog. Okay, we're going to move on to the next pattern, and that's the idea of taking those stories, taking the scope of what we have for our next horizon, and being able to specify collaboratively the details of what has to go into each of those stories. So as I mentioned, 2 related patterns here. It's specifying collaboratively and illustrating using examples. And the idea is that we take an item of scope, take a user story, and what we'll identify are the key examples associated with that. And this activity, or this pattern, is a low-tech activity. It's, as the name suggests, it's just about using collaboration, getting as many different viewpoints from the team, from an implementation point of view, from a testing point of view, from a business point of view, at the very least, and getting those people together and saying, well, what are the key aspects of what this needs to do, and try to identify what the key examples are that are going to be useful for creating a shared understanding. So we're going to do that now for just one rule out of Blackjack. So there's one that where did it go? Dealer hits until 17 or higher. That is a fairly sort of central rule in Blackjack. And so we're going to use that as our first exercise. So I need you to self-organize for this. I've got whiteboard sheets. I don't really care how large the groups are, but I would suggest 3 is good, 4 is probably the limit. So all I want is that you spread yourselves out into groups no larger than 4, and I want someone with a pink sticker on them to be included in every group, okay? So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 whiteboard sheets up. As I said, we may not need to use all those given this, the size of the room. We've got 2, 3, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. There's only 15 people, so 5 groups of 3 is probably a good arrangement. Okay, so can I get you to self-organize at those whiteboard sheets? There's a whiteboard pen by each of them. And what I want you to do is find the key examples that illustrate that rule. I'm not going to give you any more steer than that, because part of the exercise is to see how you approach this. So, groups of 3, yes, with one more person here. Okay, so introduce yourselves. There's whiteboard pens somewhere near you. There's ones sitting down there. You get the lucky one with a little eraser on the end. You guys don't. Please, please, please be careful not to go outside the boundaries of your whiteboard. I will be crucified if you draw on the walls here. That's hence the big red boundaries. So, take a few minutes doing that, and then we'll compare how you're going after a few minutes.
They're going to go against when, yes, it's set.
Well, I mean, you can after that, one more time.
Yeah, so I take those 8 pieces. Yes. I think in that quite a few, because if you just have one count, and then people can know how likely they are.
Okay, guys, can I pause you all there for a minute, because this is a really important stage. Now, and I was kind of waiting just for this group to get their first example up, and it took a little longer than I had, but yeah, normally I would pause you a little for that. Now, you've all made a pretty good start. What I always do when doing this exercise is is an echo of the way I recommend that you try this if you're doing this in your own working environment. Rather than have the group of people who say, right, well, we're going to try this collaborative specification for the first time, let's all get around the whiteboard and work it out, split the group up. Split the group as far as the group will sustain it, even if it's just splitting it into 2 groups, and get people to work on it independently. Now, I intentionally didn't give you any steer on what your example should look like. I just said find key examples, all right? Now, what I like to do is therefore compare how different groups approach that problem. And almost always there'll be variation in there. So I want to very, very quickly just get you to look at what the other teams have done. And not to spend too long on the choices they've made, the examples. It's literally how would you parse their data, how have they structured their examples. So these two, maybe it's a coincidence because they're close together, have almost identical. I think they've just been copying each other, okay?
That's for your group.
Massively divergent.
But they crossed out their 10 and 6 hit, and they started with 10 and 7 stick, which was what these guys did. But anyway, fairly obvious. It's just a sequence of cards. Interestingly, one example showing more than 2 cards, and then a slightly interesting answer here. So they're saying they draw 2. In the other cases, they stick. Okay, so I understand that. It looks like that team were doing something similar, but yours, I guess, is your structure a bit simpler? Is it just hit or stick? Is that really
We
what?
just have to do kind of like we can show the draws rather than just having.
Okay. Pause there. What did this team do? You did a similar thing. A pair of cards. Looks like a value here, and whether you hit or not as a true or false. Okay, I like that. What did you guys eventually reach?
We've only got one example, but this is the current set of cards.
Yep.
Whether you just realise I've changed the domain language there.
Yes, that is an important thing.
Yeah.
We do want to stick to, there's me saying stick, I'm already influenced by it. We want to use the domain language, or use it consistently. Think of this writ large in domain-driven design and all those sorts of things. You want to find a ubiquitous language that persists through your examples and can end up in your code, is using the tests, the specifications, everything. So whatever is the right term, whatever the terminology that your product owner or stakeholder selects is the one you should go for. So I'm going to make it, these guys are good because they've got hits. They've avoided the whole stick or stand problem. But I'm going to say if your choice is a hit or stand, okay? But maybe do what these guys did and these guys did. It's hit, yes or no. So let's stick with that. Okay, and let's quickly look at the guys in the cozy corner here. So you've got a title there, deal hit still 70 or higher, and then how do I interpret the rest of your data there?
So the numbers in sequence of the cards that you've been dealt.
Yep.
So you're summing as you go along, and pulling 70 or higher. So I call it stop. But I guess in your terminology that's their standard.
Okay, so is it fair to say that in that example, when I had the 2 and the 3, I hit, and then when I had the 2 and the 3 and the 10, I hit,
Yep.
and then when I had the 2 and the 3 and the 10 and the 2, I didn't hit.
Yep.
That's really what that's showing, okay? And for your 10, 8, and 9, 9, because each of those are above 17, there's nothing else there. So that's kind of the way you're representing that. So that's very common. I often see, often see people do this, and it's sort of like, they often put arrows or something like that. It's not uncommon. The thing is, that was surprised me is that nobody chose to work over here, and that was the trap I was opening a leg. What I always do, I always put one whiteboard sheet up landscape, and almost always this is the group that uses that style. It says, well, I have these 2 cards, and I draw an arrow, and I get this, and I hit, and I do this. There's something about the cue, the very subtle cue of the way the medium is represented that influences the way we represent it. Everyone else ends up with much more columnar things because I put it portrait. So just be conscious of those sorts of things. It was interesting that in this case I couldn't attribute it to the shape of the whiteboard, but because it happens so often, it makes me sort of always stress, be very careful of the kind of tools you might use. Always use the most fluid thing, which is a whiteboard in this case. If you start to use Excel or anything like that, thinking that it will be quicker and neater and faster, you'll be so biased by the restrictions or the constraints of that tool that it will unduly influence what you do. Okay, what I'm going to do is get us to synchronize now on a single style so that we can focus on what are the best examples, what are the best things to actually put in there. So, what's the relative merits of these? The most different one was the one in the corner. So we're going to get the group to comment on what is good or bad about the ones that people in the corner used compared to your own, for example. Complexity. Okay. So what's your argument?
Well, that it's kind of layering up the examples, really. Whereas you got putting a few examples, but then each example is more complicated because it's showing that you've got a progression of cars. Whereas you can have more examples, but they're more discrete.
Yeah. Okay. So what would be the solution? I mean, they created quite a good example of sort of the dealer hitting a couple of times. What would be the alternative to that in your format, for example?
I think that example is illustrating kind of the game flow as opposed to this is about a number that you get to, regardless of how you got there.
Yes. I would tend to agree with that. Okay, and they would argue, well, isn't that what you did in your...
That's exactly what I was going to say. Yes. What's different about your fourth example to our top example?
It's a funny old world.
But the thing is, I suppose that is really, that's not, I mean, it's not actually regret, it's not the...
So your answer should have been, it's in blue.
Yeah.
So, I think that what the argument is trying to get to here is that yes, you can effectively decompose that style into this by saying, well, yeah, 2, 3, 5, and 7 is actually a span, whereas 2, 3, and 5 is a hit. And you can sort of draw the conclusion from that. Yeah, influenced by the drawing. So, and if you want to complete the state, 2 and 3 is also a hit. So, yes, you can achieve the same amount of information, but yeah, I think I would support the sort of complexity argument, is that what we want these to end up being is testable cases, and therefore we want to make it a reasonably simple sort of state of, well, given these cards in the hand, what is the action that needs to be returned by the do I hit calculator. So, now what about the embellishment of these guys? They've got the same style with one little extra column in here. Do we like that or not?
We did, that's what we like.
Probably that team likes it. Yeah. So whenever I see something extra, I mean, I like the fact that you've got headings on your elements here. There isn't a heading over those numbers.
It was a last minute addition. It was really just the total of the cars, just to help illustrate the point.
Okay. So what about, I also always like to see what I call signs of battle, where there's evidence that you've changed something in the process. Now, this is another tip. Even though we are using whiteboard pens and you've got fancy ones that have little erasers on the end, I always recommend don't rub things out, cross them out and write something else next to it. Another tip is give everyone a whiteboard pen and try to maximize the number of colors. And that will really highlight how much dispute or discrepancy was there amongst different people in your team around particular areas. If it was just a basic thing of, oh, that was a bad idea, get rid of it. But if it's, well, somebody had 12, I think it was, under the 22, and then you changed to 22, that's a really interesting point of discussion. So what was the logic here, or what are people's thoughts on whether that's correct or not?
From our view, the original idea was, I was going on the idea that ACE was either 1 or 11. And we decided that we were talking about a simple game, which guess it had to be 11. Let's say 2 aces became 22.
Okay, so that's a good rationale, but I'm going to make an executive decision that no, by the time we've done this, we've actually beefed that up and said we couldn't tolerate that simplistic ace rule for that long, and therefore these examples need to treat the ace correctly. Okay, so what would be the correct answer there?
Well, then we would be into 12 and it would be a hit.
Yes, okay.
So the more important thing actually, and I think someone there might have said it, it's actually relevant what the cards come to.
Yes.
Because what you could say is, if your the total of the cards that you've been dealt to date is less than 17, the result is hit.
Yes.
And that's ultimately the specification.
Indeed, and I was...
The other thing is total cards dealt today, because that gets rid of the sequencing issue that I guess we have.
That's right, so you're right, and that's why arguably that sort of fully factored out version sort of gets around it, because yeah, we don't really care how we end up with 2, 3, 5, and 7. It's just if those are the cards in your hand, then this is the action, I hit or not. So we could almost sort of say, yeah, just imagine it's a set or it's an array of numbers. Put commas between them or something. We don't care how many are there, or as you say, how you got them. It's just saying this is a finite state thing. If those are the cards I've got, my action is hit or not hit. But you raise the point of, well, and it sort of hints at by here of what really the relationship is between that number and 17 as to whether I hit or not. And a lot of people start this exercise saying, well, okay, my examples are less than 17, hit, equal 17, stand, above 17, stand. And I say, okay, well, you know, if I'm testing that, what can I put in here? Can I put in -5? You know, can I put in 40? You know, what are those are valid examples of less than 17 or above 17, but they're not valid hand values. So if we imagine, okay, I guess the next question is, how many examples do we need if we start to shift our focus to what is the, how good are the examples we chose, what's the rationale in there? So I can see some similar examples. I can see 10.7 as a common thing, 10.8, yeah, 10.6. Now these are common examples because they're at the boundaries. It's fairly natural for people to tend towards, okay, well, if I want to illustrate this rule, I should be illustrating at the boundaries. So that's fairly common. And interestingly, you guys chose quite different to that. Was there any thought behind that?
So this was equivalent to partition, so this was a less than 17 value.
Okay, so your next one would have been an above 17.
Yeah, and I've probably done boundaries for
Yeah. So when we, if we think we could go through this process, and once we've even agreed what our structure is, we can spin up clearly a huge number of possible examples. And people start to ask the question, well, I'm going to get bored because there's a zillion combinations I could put here. And that's quite intentional. That's why it's also one sheet of, in this case, A1 paper to do your examples. Because if you want to do 100, chances are these are not going to be very interesting examples. So that's why the pattern, or the outcome of this pattern, is to create the key examples. So we need to sort of start to make a value judgment about what are good examples versus bad examples. That's the other reason why it's useful to think of them examples and not, say, tests or test cases. Because you generally don't think in terms of, oh, that's a good test case or a bad test case. It's just a test case, if you're interested in it at all. Whereas if it's an example, you can tend to say, oh, that's a good example. Well, that's a less interesting example. Or here's a better example than that one. It's easier for you to think in those terms because it's almost a subconscious, how close is this example to the stuff that matters in terms of the business rules. So what I want to do is, you've got good examples there. I wanted to see whether any other interesting cases needed to come out. Sorry, yes, you are hiding a couple of these here. So what's interesting in here? So 10 and 6. Oh yes, you took the whole sort of set thing very, very literally. That's good. What's that say? What is that? 10, 3, and 3? Yeah. Okay, so just another example of 16, and then a 17, another example of, that looks like 16 to me.
Yeah, so I was coming around to listen to what you were saying. I also call it drawer instead of standard.
In this case, we know what the min and max would be. Yes.
So the min will be 2, the max will be.
Okay, hold that thought. So, yeah, if we just said, what are the minimum and maximum values? Or if I put it this way, if I said that, let's label yours, I'm going to call this, we need to choose our domain terms, but I'm going to call this hand value. If we're allowed to treat hand value as a sort of first order domain object or domain concept, how easy would the illustration of this rule be? So I forced you to say, give me concrete examples of dealer hits in terms of cards, but if I said, do that in terms of hand value, how much simpler does this become?
Much.
Yeah. So if I said, well, given a hand value and a hit answer, what would be the examples I need that are the key examples?
2 to 16.
Well, 2, interesting.
Well, you could say 2 to 27.
Yeah. And you just itemize all of them, would you? And so I'd expect something like a yes to that, a no to that, and then I'd have an interesting boundary or something here, would I?
16, 17.
That's sort of our key boundary. What do people think of that? Firstly, challenge it.
It's all right. Sorry, it's all right. Some of the rules don't change.
Okay, well you're also the one who correctly realised, okay, we've got a minimum and maximum possibility here. Is that the minimum?
It basically 1 or 11.
Well, that's the assumption that you've got 2 cards.
Well, yes, that is my assumption because I can't have less than that, and also I'm assuming the correct use of the ACE rule. So whenever we put these on, we think, okay, if I am allowed to use hand value as a valid input, if I'm allowed to call that a first order domain entity, I would need examples that show how I correctly calculate that hand value. So imagine I had let you go on for another 10 minutes and you sort of filled up your page with examples. That wouldn't be wasted because I would simply get you to refactor it to say, well, instead of the answer being do I hit or not hit, it would look a lot more like this team, which would say, given these cards, what is my hand value? So can we have an example of a hand value of that? What did you
Really, 2 aces would be 12.
Well, I see your example says ace is 22. Some debate as to whether it was 12. You see what I mean? That this forces us to say, okay, well, actually, that's not a. What is the smallest hand value?
Must be 4.
It is 4. And similarly, 27. What do we think of an upper end? Is that our maximum? Some people would say 30.
Where did 27 come from? Don't understand 27.
16 plus an ace.
Okay, yes. So that's based on the idea that you could get to 16 and still have to take another card.
Oh, sorry.
And you took an ace, but that's actually 17. So you could get to 16 and get a 10. And so on this logic, 26 is the highest, because remember, an ace would count as 1 in that case, because the rule is you don't count the ace as 11 on a foot make it fast.
Okay.
So, but do we like 26 as a maximum? Since that's bust, 22 is also bust. Now, is 26 more bust than 22? It's not really. For the rules of the game, it doesn't really matter how bust you are. The bust status of your hand is the important thing. So we can say, well, let's just not call that 26, and let's just say, well, I get down to 21, and I have bust as a potential hand value. And if that's what my business owner talks about, then that's a valid thing. You might insist, well, hang on, but that won't fit into an integer. So, well, tough luck. If bust is a valid hand value, your system has to handle that. And so it makes us think, okay, well maybe this idea of hand value is something a little more complex than just a number. So what's another, so we could have various examples. So you could add, keep your ace there, but just put, let's choose the, we had two really interesting examples. Please put up 10, 6, ace. And then below that, put 10, 6, 10. Okay, so we agree the answer to the first one is 17, 10, 6, 10. But 10, 6, and 10 is bust. Now there's one more interesting hand value that we need in our list. So these are all fine, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. What's a special value that's like 21? Yeah. So blackjack is also a hand value. So where's, okay, so there's an example of that up there. So why is that, why is 10 and ace not 21? Or if it's not 21, what's an example that is 21?
So example 21 will be 10, 6, 5.
Excellent, please put that one up. So, and now let's refactor 10 and ace to say blackjack, or just BJ if you like. Good, now we're getting closer, because now we're saying that for our simple table, that is just about dealer hits to 17 or higher, we include all the possible values from a minimum up to our sort of maximum, if you think of bust as a maximum. And if we wish, we could put all those values in between. As I say, it's not a huge number, so it's manageable, but we can sort of see that it's a fairly boring pattern from 4 to 16. And then we could argue, okay, yeah, all of these are bust is a no, blackjack is a no, 21 is a no, etc. Now the very fact that I've drawn it like that suggests that 16 is a more interesting example than 12. 4 is a more interesting example than 5. Blackjack and bust are both interesting examples. They probably both justify their place in this set of examples. What I really want is for each set like this to end up with roughly that, that sort of 7 plus or minus 2 range of key examples that sort of fit neatly in my head as being the best examples I can think of to illustrate this rule. And then similarly we could sort of, and it's a little harder for hand value because there are lots of interesting cases that lead to those, but you might partition those. You might say, what are good examples of leading to bust? Or what are the examples of blackjack? What are the examples of 21 versus blackjack? Those would be good things to pay attention to. So it's this idea of sort of partitioning my domain concepts by virtue of having explored the examples. That's one of the sort of key things that we're doing in this exercise, is getting a better understanding of what it is that we're modeling our system essentially. That's what we're doing. So the examples are really far more than just tests or more than just sort of documentation. They are examples of the model. Yes.
Very simple. I've got to look here with the blackjack, in particular bust. It wasn't bust one of the other parts of the system we were going to model. We haven't actually just modeled that first.
Yeah, good point. So that's right. So we would, if we are deferring being able to bust when we have the dealer hits until 17, then yeah, we need to say what is valid. But personally, I think that would be part of our analysis. That would say, it doesn't make sense that you let the dealer hit if the dealer can't go bust. So instead, you therefore, being able to bust would have to precede in our implementation priority the notion of being able to hit a step. Or indeed, it would be together. That is, if you do the hit story, you kind of have to deal with bust as part of implementing that story. Okay, now how are we getting for time? No, we better conclude that one there then. So I know it was only a very, very brief little exercise to do that, but as I say, the important things is, what are the consequences of what you do? So one of the key points is when you do this kind of exercise, spread your group into multiple groups, and I call it divide and conquer. So divide yourself up, let yourself go. Don't confer or don't insist on a common style, but then look at each other's style and try to find the best elements of each of them. Critique what's good or bad about each of them, and find, okay, let's concur on a common format, and then move forward with that. That way you can focus, you quickly move from trying to understand the structure of your examples to what are the good examples versus or what are the more interesting versus less interesting examples.
Will this also tell you whether your domain definitions are actually good domain definitions?
Yes, absolutely. And it's also often where new domain concepts sort of burst into life, because we need to be able to name something in order to address a point of complexity. This is another thing that Eric Evans says, is whenever you've got complexity in your system, it's usually because there's a hidden domain concept waiting to come out. And so for us, it was being able to talk about hand value drastically simplified, or allowed us to fan in all our possible cards into a very small range of possible values. But then having understood those values well, and having discussed what really does a hand value mean, and get that really tightened down, allows us to say, okay, now that's a useful thing to be able to use in this. And imagine the next exercise I could give you would be, okay, what about the game outcome? Now that, again, that would be a nice simple thing to say, well, if it's really a comparison of the hand value between the dealer and the hand value of the player. So again, that would become an input to a set of examples that said, well, in this case, you get a win or a lose or a push, or indeed you get this payout based on a given bet. So the emergence of those concepts are what comes out of this. In fact, I'll show you that in a second, because we did a few examples of ACEs. That's usually where, if I'm doing the longer version of this exercise, people tend to gravitate around ACEs, and you see lots of really sometimes quite weird sets of examples of ACE behavior, because it is arguably the most complex part of calculating the hand value. Okay, thanks for your indulgence. I'll let you sit down. So returning to our overall patterns, we've been through the top end. We specified collaboratively, and we illustrated with examples to end up with key examples. And those key examples were really just, stuff on the whiteboard, as we've done here. But obviously that in itself was useful for sort of making sure everyone, a few light bulbs went off about understanding what we were talking about. But it's not particularly good for long-term documentation. So really the next pattern is about refining that into a specification supported by examples. So yeah, given, just as we had here, some whiteboard stuff involving ACEs, and maybe some notes about, clarifying our understanding of what we've just done as we went through that collaborative exercise, we should be able to turn that into something that sort of is dressed up a little more neatly for the rest of the organisation, or for other stakeholders who might be interested in it, such that it provides some long-term value. So we touched on the idea of, well, this is where your domain concepts come out. We talked about hand value. Another one that's related to ACEs is the idea of whether your hand is soft or hard. And the reason that's important is that there are, certain casinos will play a variation on the dealer hits until 17 rule, which says the dealer can hit a soft 17. That is, if the dealer has a hand value of exactly 17, but that comprises an ace that's counted as 11, then they can draw, or they must draw another hand if that rule is in place. And so, we can dedicate a whole set of examples in our specification, in our refined specification, that deals specifically with that. So we have a title about what this is about. You kind of, what's the phrase you put into Google to arrive at this? That's your short heading, like soft hand. You've got just some basic plain language text, describing what the rules are or describing any kind of background, and then you're saying, okay, here are the examples that support it. In this case, we've got the same format that we had here, one set of inputs, which is the cards in our hand, the output is the hand value, but an additional expected output is whether it's soft or hard, and then we just, in this case, put some notes against each of those examples to state why we think that's a good example, or what that example is showing. So this is what I would call the refined specification. It's just the progression away from the quick sort of set of examples on a whiteboard into something that actually can stand up as some long-term documentation. What we want to do with that specification with examples, though, is I guess the hard bit of BDD and SPE, and is often the bit that people leap into without really focusing on all this stuff that sort of ought to have happened before that, which is just, okay, how do I automate this as tests? How do I get this into something like Cucumber or whatever? And focusing too heavily on that without really thinking about, well, have I really done this, and have I really got those, and am I really creating one of these? That can be a bit of a danger. However, let's look at this transformation of this particular pattern. The pattern's about automating the validation of our specifications without changing. And that clause, the without changing the specification, is the important part. So, what we're trying to show here is that, okay, it was a different example, but you get it, it's all in the blackjack domain. So here's our specification. In this case, this page is about the game outcome, as we just mentioned. Simply a relationship between the dealer's hand value and the player's hand value. What is the outcome? Is it a win for the player, or a lose for the player, a push, or something else? But notice that we've got these things color-coded because in this case we've put our specifications into a framework that supports it. This particular example is fitness. There's lots of other choices that do the same thing. So that it's comparing what does the specification say versus what the system actually does, given exactly that data. So here, each of these rows is a separately verifiable case that says, okay, if the player's hand value is 20, the dealer's hand value is 19, if I plug those data values into the system, does it in fact say that the outcome is a win? If so, just highlight that cell in green because it's what we expected. But here we've got a difference between what was expected. So the spec said, you expected that if the player has a bust and the dealer has a bust, you said that should be a push. The system is treating that as a lose for the player. Now, in fact, the system in this case is correct. If you bust, the dealer eventually busts, unfortunately you still lost at the casino. But it might be that this is an interesting sort of bit around the edges where it might be that, well, okay, for our free version, for the non-money-based game, maybe we would rather increase the odds in favour of the player so that over time they believe they're winning more often than they're losing. So maybe we would treat that as a push and not a lose. It's only when they upgrade to the paid version we say, okay, well, in the fine print, here's the real rules. So these examples around the edges of what's important is exactly the definition of what are the key examples that we need to illustrate when we're doing these things. I'm sorry there's lots of words here, but I felt that with this particular pattern, it's often easier to highlight what we mean by showing the kind of anti-patterns that are more commonly in place. So imagine that we've done everything that we did in the first part of our patterns cycle, and imagine we got to having a good collaborative workshop. We had different points of view in the room. We had testers, we had developers, we had business people there, and we nutted it out and got a good set of examples. And then we go away from that and we start doing some of these anti-patterns. So it might be that we just say, okay, that's fine, I can automate those tests, I'm going to put them all in JUnit. Or it might be that the tester says, well, okay, yeah, that was useful, but I'll, when it comes to testing, when you finish the work, then I'll do some acceptance tests for that. Or you're using a tool that sort of means that your acceptance tests are only visible to people who are licensed to use this tool, and that's just the test department, something like that, and nobody else ever dares go near it because it's awful. Or so much time has passed that we actually didn't bother taking the things that we believed were the key examples from these workshops, and instead the testers are arbitrarily choosing their own values. So we could have much less interesting examples in our testing. And the other anti-pattern is, well, our product owner can't see any of these tests because none of them are expressed with a framework that actually allows you to examine what the intention of the test is. And so they don't know whether the things that we agreed from these things or the things that were written down are really still the case. In other words, we're relying on documentation, however carefully created and nicely presented, it's still just a snapshot in time. And unfortunately, the system can drift away from that. We don't have any warning because it's just a Word document. The mechanism by which we automate the validation of these specifications is a fairly simple set of relationships. It does depend, I guess, the details obviously depend on what type of framework you're using. Once again, these examples happen to be fitness, but the principle is exactly the same if you're using SpecFlow or Cucumber or whatever. Essentially, you've got a relationship between three different entities. There's the visible part, the test table, or it's mostly a table, or it's a given when then scenario or something like that, but it's the expressive part of the test bit that is meaningful to people, describes what the test is doing, doesn't focus on how it's automated or how it's implemented. That visible part needs to be supported by fixture code. It needs to be this is the glue or the automation that sort of makes it work. And that's really just as simple as possible, a set of pass-throughs, excuse me, to the application under test. So our domain code is just what it is. It's the thing that does what it does. It's the thing that works out should we take another car or not. Our test fixture is not production code, but it's what's necessary to allow these data values to be compared, to be pumped into the system under test. Now you can see that if I've got a system model that does not really line up very nicely against my test or specification model, then this fixture has to do a lot of work. It's got to do the translation between what the test is talking about and start speaking the language of the system under test. And that's a bad thing. You don't really want to have to give yourself a lot of work here making complex fixture code. So there's an incentive to make sure that our representations of examples and tests nicely line up with the actual model of the system that's being tested. That's why it's very important that this is a collaborative process and an iterative process. If you attempt to say, why don't we just go through a big specification document and we get people to write out all the examples of that, and then we hand that into the dev process and that will eventually pump out in the test process, that generally won't work. You do need to make sure that there's enough cyclic influence, if you like, enough backwards feedback, such that as we evolve our domain model, as we evolve the system under development, that allows us to think more clearly about what is the system, what is our model of the system, such that future discussions, future examples and collaboration workshops are building upon the existing model of the system. That is, our mental model that the business users talk about is neatly reflected in the underlying system model. And if we can achieve that, then this fixture code remains nice and thin, not complicated, and not subject to nasty bugs. We're nearly at the end. So the last thing is, how do we get from executable specifications to living documentation? Well, the way we do that is through evolving a documentation system iteratively as we go. And it has to be said, this is arguably the hardest pattern to achieve. We visit a lot of teams and those that are really at a position where you can say they've got living documentation, it's something they've achieved. They've spent several years getting there, and they've usually failed several times as they've worked towards this goal. But if you start with an understanding of living documentation as being your objective, that will help you make better decisions in these kind of near-term things as you're applying perhaps pieces of this process cycle, or thinking on particular patterns. If you always think in terms of, would this stand up as living documentation? If I visited this in 6 months' time, or if somebody who wasn't here in the room started to read out the output of what we came up with, would it make sense? If you think in those terms, then you'll find you improve those artifacts. So an important concept to lead towards this is understanding the distinction between the things that are short-lived artifacts and those that are long-lived artifacts. And we should not be too story-centric. In an agile process, we want to find nice, small, regular stories that we can sort of get a consistent flow out of. That's a good thing. But you've got to be careful not to assume that, well, I just need to attach examples to each story and then I'm done. I do specification by example. It's because the story itself is really just about one chain, one brush stroke, if you like, in the painting that we're creating. What we want is documentation to be the painting. It's the effect of all those brush strokes. It's the thing at a point in time that is the overall picture, whether it's just an early sketch or whether it's something more mature. So each change we make, each story we implement, can have an associated specification to tell us that whether we're doing this right or not. But really, they are logically separate things because the specification remains as a long-term artifact, whereas the story is just a temporary thing that's done and gets ticked off and you tear up the card and so forth. So each of these things really sit in close relationship. So the story is about the change, the spec is about documenting the effect of the change. Each story should have acceptance criteria that tells you when that story is done, and that will include automated tests that will live on as regression tests in the overall suite of our system. And similarly, anything that we document associated with a given story, we need to be able to pick that information out and piece it together in the appropriate place in our living documentation system. And I put wiki on here just because that's a common format, but whatever it is, it needs to be the long-term picture. Don't attempt to use Jira or something like that for living documentation because it's just a collection of tasks and statuses. Okay, I should have zoomed in on that, shouldn't I? That is my overall patterns, and miraculously, that's us pretty much on time. So thanks very much, but if we've got a few minutes for questions, if there are any, otherwise you get first dibs at the coffee and cake, please. Okay, thanks very much for attending. So, good afternoon. Thanks very much for attending this session. My name is David Evans. I work for a small specialist consultancy called Yuri. It's essentially myself, GOTO, the author of a book, or a couple of books, including the title of this session, Specification by Example. Now, a 90-minute session is a slightly unusual format. It's not a very common session at conferences. Obviously, you've always got typical 45-minute talks, or you've got workshops and so forth. And this is kind of a little bit in between. So it is an experiment for me because I haven't done this format before. So my timing might be at risk. We'll see how we go. The point, however, is that 90 minutes is definitely too long for you to be sat there listening to me talk at you. It's a little short for us to sort of get properly into workshops, but given that it's not too large a group, I'm hoping that we can focus on some interactive exercise for this, because for this topic, it could be argued that the theory behind it is actually pretty straightforward. The difficulty is in how do you actually do this? You know, all the questions seem to arise when you actually try it out for yourself. So I'm going to give us a couple of opportunities to try things out directly. The central premise, if you like, or the central thesis, the specification by example, is pretty straightforward. And I tend to sum it up just with this little diagram. So it's really the basis that being able to use concrete examples, being able to use examples that our business people, the users of our software, would use in their descriptions of expected behavior or expected software requirements is a very natural thing for people to do, and yet we don't really treat examples as first-order items in our process. We tend to think of examples as just a means to an end. You might have a business analyst or someone like that going and talking to users to understand the way their process works, and they'll say, well, for example, I would do this or that, and it's, oh, okay, right, give me another example. Well, under this circumstances, I might do something different. And they generalize the rules out of that. Well, that's fine, that's what we need to do, because we need to end up software that satisfies the general rule. The trouble is those examples tend to just be thrown away because we've now got a much more formal specification or analysis document that just covers the general case. Of course, the problem is that when we've got that general specification, somebody needs to turn that into code, so you tend to need to think in concrete terms when you're actually doing your design. You need to understand, well, what are the actual cases by which this would be used. So you might be inventing examples in your head for that process. Similarly, software gets handed off to testers. What do they need to do? Well, they need to come up with examples for use as test cases. What is focusing here on making sure we don't just treat each story as an item to be ticked off a backlog, but instead we say that the result of each change that we make should be contributing towards a body of documentation that actually is living in the sense that it's always being updated, it's always sort of keeping pace with the evolution of our software, but it's also living in the sense that it's self-checking because it's comprised of executable specifications. So we know when there's a discrepancy or a regression or a drift away from what we say the system does versus what it actually does. So it's living in that sense. Okay, so over the course of this session, I'm going to examine through a couple of exercises the details of a few of these important patterns. We won't have time to do them all, but we'll sort of pick out the important ones. So this first area of being able to derive our scope from business goals, there's a number of techniques that are useful here. I'm just going to pick on one of them today. Sorts of things that we do. This is all sort of in the field of you might say stuff that happens to the left of the sprint backlog. It's all the things you do effectively as part of analysis, grooming, understanding what the longer term projections are before you actually get down to items that you would consider to be stories small enough to fit into the sprint. So impact mapping, feature injection, these are all useful things. Story mapping is the one that I'm going to look at today, not because it's any better or worse than the others. I just thought, well, we don't have time to go through all of them, and story mapping is a good, useful technique. It's fairly easy for people to get their heads around, and arguably it's the easiest one to sort of take away out of things. In order to do so, though, we're going to need to introduce a domain that will be used through the rest of these explanatory exercises. And for our purposes, that's the game of blackjack. So what I need you to do, the simplest way to do this is everyone just stands up, because A, you'll get the oxygen to your head, and then it'll be a simple sorting process. So you all have to stand up to start with. Now, there'll be a series of questions. So if you've when you remain standing, if you've ever played either blackjack, 21, or pontoon, they're all colour games. If that's not true of anyone, you can sit down. As long as you've played any of those games sometime in your life? Yes, remain standing. Good. Okay, a couple of you have never heard of 21 pontoon or blackjack. Okay, fine. Of those who are still standing, who would say that they would remember what the basic rules of blackjack are in terms of, well, you bust if you're more than 21, and you can hit, you can stand. You basically, you'd roughly be able to explain that to someone. If that's not true, you can sit down. Or why it might not be working as effectively as you'd like. Maybe it's because some of the patterns in this set are things that your organisation, it wasn't sort of consciously addressing or hasn't really been able to overcome. So in very, very quick terms, one starts sort of here around about 11 o'clock with a business goal or some kind of desired effect for a given period of time, whether that's a release period or whether it's a sprint. Typically, it's something a little higher level. It's some kind of business milestone. And the pattern of deriving scope from goals is what turns that consciously into items of work that a delivery team can actually pick up. So typically, that's going to be user stories if you're using an Agile process, but it could be something, some equivalent or similar thing like use cases. And that sort of conscious linking of the business goal to the scope is the important part of that pattern. The next sort of pattern, well, it's really a pair of patterns, is being able to specify collaboratively, and we take each of those items and need to get to the details of them. And in doing so, we illustrate the important details with concrete examples. So specifying collaboratively and illustrating with examples is what we do with our user stories, and from those we derive key examples that help us to understand or get to a common understanding of what's important in each of those. There's a subsequent pattern of refining a specification. That's where the key examples, which really are just a very low fidelity thing. Typically these are things we might create on a whiteboard, and we're going through a couple of exercises like that today to see what we mean. We need to be able to turn that into something that is a little more long-lived, something that actually can serve a few more purposes. So the thing that we create out of that is a specification supported by examples, a specification with examples. So it's simply a style that sort of blends some plain language descriptions of what our business rules are, supported by concrete examples that illustrate those rules. The pattern across the bottom there is probably what people are most familiar with if they're thinking BDD or ATDD, and that's the actual sort of creating automated tests out of these things. The pattern that we sort of stress as important here is that we're automating validation without changing the specifications. That is, whatever was useful as documentation, whatever was very readable and understandable at this point, when we've refined into something strong, that should be the same thing that becomes our automated test. That's what we like to say, that what we're creating is not just automated test, but executable specification. Specification is self-checking. And then the final sort of pattern of evolving a documentation system and validating frequently or validating continuously is what allows us to get from sets of individual executable specifications into what we'll call a living documentation system. So okay, good. Now, of the people that are still standing, this time I want you to raise your hand if you've been in a casino and played blackjack at a casino betting your own money. Okay, only one? All right, good. That means I need everyone else to remain standing. And just stick a little pink one of these on you. Make it easier to identify you. And I'll get you to hand the others back for me. Thanks. And sorry, the gentleman who did raise his hand, is that you? Okay, so you do need a pink sticker, but I'm also going to ask you to come up front. So the rest can sit down. I want you to come to the front. Get your pink sticky on. But it's all right, I'm not picking on you because I'm picking on you as well. So you'll need to stand up as well. So your name is?
Michael.
Okay, Michael.
Sorry.
Michael and Simon are going to help us through this exercise, okay, as our resident blackjack experts. So what I'm going to do is I just want to quickly distinguish between, say, a simple version of blackjack. Imagine it's our job to build a game of blackjack that sort of follows all the casino betting rules. But we want to start with a simple version rather than the full version. So on here I've sort of randomly stuck a bunch of sort of, well, pseudo scope items. Some of these are rules, some of these are sort of things that happen in the game, like events. Some of them are just sort of general things that you need to consider. And your job as a pair is to distinguish between a simple game of blackjack versus a full game of blackjack that you might sort of find in a casino. Okay, so all of these things should be familiar to you because you're self-identified as people who know what blackjack is. So what I'm going to do is I just want you to put things above the line or below the line. So that's a simple game above that line, and that's the full game below the line. All right, but talk to each other and talk so that the audience can see it. But maybe one of you come this side and one stay on the other side, so everyone can see what your thought process is. And fairly quickly sort them into things that would be included in a simple game and leave the other stuff below the line.
Player and dealer can build it and bases basic rule in simple games. Multiplayer, get stand, yeah. Deal 2 cards each.
A bit more kind of
winning. I see we're doing a gambling game.
no,
So you
good
could
about
place
this
there. No.
Some example scenarios I could put this software through in order to test that I've satisfied the requirements. Once again, we're sort of treating the examples at each point as a temporary throwaway thing. And everyone's sort of reinventing different sets of examples without sort of having a common viewpoint. So specification by example is really just a simple idea of saying, what if we preserved those examples that we used as a discussion with the users or the stakeholders in the first place as first order items in our process? What if we actually gave them some importance and care and preserved them such that they could inform all of the steps in our process, from design, implementation, and testing? So this little triangle is commonly used as the summary of SPE. It's that it's showing this dual relationship that examples have in being able to clarify what we mean when we talk about our general software requirements. But if expressed in the right way and expressed with the right level of detail, those same examples that are just useful for getting a shared understanding can actually be used as the same test cases that would verify that we've in fact satisfied those requirements when we do the implementation. That's a very, as I say, simple idea of SPE. Content of this session is about taking that simple idea and showing that there are a number of useful patterns that emerge from that. And these patterns are really what we've seen good teams use in applying the ideas of SPE or BDD, acceptance test-driven development, and some other things. Because sometimes people say, well, what is the difference between SPE and BDD? It's a very common question. And we like to say, well, at its heart, it's the same idea, but SPE sort of encompasses a number of patterns that you might sort of say, well, you're not doing, that's not BDD if you're just doing that. If you're just talking in terms of examples, then that's not BDD. Or if you're just using a particular type of test automation tool, well, that's not a proper BDD tool. You get a lot of concerns or questions like that. We're saying, well, as long as you're adopting some of these patterns, then you could arguably say that you're doing SPE. So what are those patterns? Well, in a nutshell, this is the sort of cycle. And be careful to point out that this is not not meant to be a process flow. As I say, very few teams actually succeed in doing all of these things consistently all the time. What we do see is teams that say, well, we major on this particular pattern, we major on this particular aspect in order to help us succeed. And I'm hoping that what you'll find from here, if you're already doing something like acceptance test-driven development or BDD, that you might sort of be able to see some of the reasons why you might be struggling.